You know that feeling, right? When you're totally reliant on something, maybe some tech or a service, and it just fails you.
Yeah, it's incredibly frustrating.
Now, just imagine if that lifeline was your wheelchair.
Hmm.
Imagine being, well, stranded, your independence just gone, waiting weeks, maybe even months for a basic repair.
It's hard to even picture for most of us.
Exactly. And look, you're listening because you want to understand the uh, the deeper forces shaping things around us.
Mm.
So today we're doing a deep dive that uncovers some pretty surprising stuff.
We're diving into the wheelchair industry. It's often overlooked, isn't it?
Definitely.
And our sources show this landscape that's really dominated by two massive private equity players, New Motion and National Seating and Mobility.
Right.
But this isn't just, a story about a couple of big companies. It's basically a duopoly controlling access for so many people who depend on these devices.
Yeah, a duopoly. And our mission here isn't just to point fingers. We really want to unpack how this happened.
Right.
What are the real-world consequences for people using wheelchairs?
Mhm.
And really crucially, understand the systemic issues. Why has this been allowed to happen? We need to go beyond just saying, oh, it's a policy failure.
Yeah, there's more to it. Our sources suggest some, well, frankly, unsettling truths.
Okay, so let's start there. How did these two firms, NewMotion and NSM, get so big?
It really comes down to private equity. These investment firms, their model is typically to buy companies, then look for ways to boost profits fast.
Which usually means cutting costs, right?
Often, yeah. Cut costs, maybe raise prices, streamline things, and then sell the company for a profit. It's usually a pretty short-term focus.
And that just feels fundamentally wrong when you're talking about durable medical equipment, doesn't it?
It really does.
Wheelchairs aren't just, I don't know, widgets. They're essential for people's freedom, their ability to just live their lives. Reliability, quick service, that's not a bonus, it's critical.
Precisely. And this profit-first model, it clashes directly with what wheelchair users actually need. Our source lays out some pretty stark consequences. Oh, massive repair delays. Weeks, even months, like you said. Service lines that are almost impossible to get through to.
Wow.
And interestingly, a real push towards selling brand new, high-margin chairs instead of just fixing the ones someone already has, even if a repair makes perfect sense.
So they'd rather sell you a whole new expensive chair than fix a part on your current one.
That seems to be the incentive structure, yeah. And there's just this perceived lack of accountability to the actual users, the people relying on them day in, day out.
It sounds like the focus totally shifts
Mhm.
from providing care, providing a service, to just hitting quarterly financial targets.
Exactly. People become, as the source puts it, kind of like line items on a spreadsheet.
Yeah, it's a disturbing way to think about it.
Yeah.
So where's the oversight? Hasn't anyone in charge noticed this?
Well, that's what's really interesting, or maybe alarming. The author points out that there has been some awareness, bits of media coverage, letters from senators.
Uh-huh.
But ultimately, no significant regulatory action has really tackled this duopoly or its effects.
You'd think something this dysfunctional, affecting vulnerable people, would set off alarm bells in government, wouldn't you?
You would think. But the perspective in our source is much sharper. They argue this isn't just bureaucracy being slow or ineffective.
Mm.
They actually suggest the system is, and this is a direct quote, working exactly as it was built to.
Wow. Okay. That's a much heavier critique. What does that mean exactly?
It implies the system itself, perhaps unintentionally or intentionally, prioritizes certain outcomes like corporate profit over others, like reliable wheelchair access.
And the source apparently doesn't see this as a simple partisan issue either, like blaming one party or the other.
No, they make the point that both Democratic and Republican administrations have overseen this period. The suggestion is a deeper issue at play.
What kind of issue?
The author posits this underlying allegiance, maybe, to capital, to the interests of finance and corporations, which kind of overrides the specific needs of disabled people, regardless of who is technically in power.
So the idea that just, voting harder or writing more letters will fix it, the source is skeptical.
Very skeptical. They argue the system wasn't really designed to prioritize disabled lives in the first place, especially when it conflicts with corporate power or economic interest.
Is there any, broader evidence for that kind of view, that the system leans that way?
Well, the author connects it to some political science research. There's a well-known study by Gulens and Page,
Okay.
which basically found that in the U.S., the policy preferences of average citizens have very little impact on what actually becomes law.
Really? So who does have impact?
Economic elites and organized business interests, their preferences are much, much more influential.
Uh, so that might explain why even if lots of people are upset about the wheelchair situation, it doesn't necessarily translate into political action. The powerful interests aren't pushing for change.
That's the connection the author draws, yes. It suggests the levers of power respond more to money and organized lobbying than to, say, public outcry or individual needs.
And this isn't new, according to the source. They see this as baked into the system somehow.
Yeah, they go back quite a way, arguing that this focus on protecting capital has deep historical roots in the U.S.
Like how?
They even point to things like the structure of the Senate or the Electoral College, arguing these were mechanisms partly designed, right from the start, to insulate the system from too much popular pressure and protect elite interests.
That's a pretty fundamental critique of the whole structure.
It is. And they use this really striking analogy, comparing modern private equity firms to the old British East India Company.
Whoa. Okay. How does that comparison work?
Think about it. A powerful private entity, driven by profit, wielding immense control over people's lives and resources, often with little regard for the human cost. The author sees parallels in how private equity operates today, not just in wheelchairs, but in housing, healthcare, other essential sectors.
So these massive private firms acting almost like their own states, in a way.
Kind of, yeah. And the argument continues that the actual government, the state, often ends up facilitating this rather than checking it.
How so? By not regulating enough.
Partly that, yes. Regulatory agencies are often underfunded, the author argues, or understaffed. Enforcement can be weak. It's not necessarily always a grand conspiracy, but the outcome is a system where capital has a lot of freedom.
Okay, so if the system is, as they say, working as built, and part of that is prioritizing capital, how does that specifically impact disabled people in wheelchairs?
This is maybe the core of the argument. The author claims capitalism doesn't just overlook the suffering or needs of disabled people. It prices it in.
Prices it in. What does that mean? That sounds harsh.
It's jarring, yeah. The idea is that within this economic logic, disabled individuals can be viewed as externalities, costs to be managed or minimized.
Right, like their needs for accessible equipment for support are seen primarily as financial liabilities on a balance sheet.
Exactly. Rather than as fundamental human rights. An externality in economics is like a side effect, right? A cost imposed on someone else. Here, the difficulty, the pain, the lack of mobility, that's the cost. And the system isn't set up to fully account for it if it impacts profit.
And the author had a personal story about this.
Yes, a very telling one. About getting a cane through their HMO. It technically fulfilled the requirement, like tick the box for cane provided, but it was ill-fitting, basically useless for their actual needs.
Just the bare minimum to satisfy the paperwork.
Pretty much. And then they contrast that with later getting a properly fitted custom cane through, personal resources and connections. It worked perfectly.
Highlighting the huge gap between just meeting a bureaucratic requirement and actually meeting a person's needs, and how access depends so much on your own resources.
Exactly. It shows the inequality baked into treating these things as products or services to be delivered at minimum cost rather than as rights.
So, taking this logic further, it leads to a really dark place. If minimizing cost is paramount.
Well, the author argues that from a purely cold economic standpoint within this system, the struggles of disabled people, the pain, the limited mobility, maybe even reduced lifespans, can be viewed as acceptable.
Acceptable losses.
Or even, in a really perverse sense, desirable outcomes. Because, fewer demands on the system might mean lower long-term costs.
That is deeply cynical, but I can see the awful logic if profit is the only metric.
And that's why, the author contends, mobility aids get framed as product lines, as investment opportunities, not as essential tools for life.
Which brings us back to the long repair delays, the denied replacements. It all stems from that core logic, profit over need.
That's the argument. It fuels the duopoly's bottom line.
Okay, so if the system itself is the problem, according to this source, what's the solution? Voting differently might not be enough, they say, so what then?
Yeah, the author is pretty clear. Don't expect a simple electoral fix within the current setup. Instead, they talk about the need for something different, a disability justice movement based on collective refusal.
Collective refusal. Refusing what?
Refusing to be grateful for crumbs, basically. Refusing to accept inadequate support. Rejecting the whole idea that their needs are too expensive, too complex, too much of a burden.
So it's about changing the narrative and demanding more.
Yes, and also about building alternatives. The refusal isn't just saying no, it's also doing things differently.
Like the examples you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Community bike shops fixing manual chairs, that's a form of refusal of the official slow, expensive system. Mutual aid groups finding equipment, building ramps.
Mm-hmm.
These are described as acts of survival, yes, but also acts of imagination, showing that care can be organized differently from the ground up.
But that gets harder with the more complex chairs, right? The powered ones.
Oh, definitely. That's a huge challenge. The source mentions proprietary software, parts you can only get from the manufacturer, supply chains they control completely.
So trying to fix it yourself or get an independent shop to do it is basically impossible, or it voids the warranty.
Often, yes. It creates this intense dependency back on the very companies that might be causing the delays in the first place. It's a real catch-22.
Which leads the author to ask some really pointed questions, doesn't it?
Yeah, big questions. Like, why aren't university engineering departments working on open source designs for assistive tech? Things anyone could build or repair.
Good question.
Or why don't public libraries have a collection of basic, repairable wheelchairs people could borrow? Why is access always something you have to buy, often through this complicated, profit-driven system, instead of it being treated like a public good?
Like roads or, well, libraries.
Exactly. Why isn't mobility seen as a fundamental right the community ensures?
So the ultimate call to action isn't about tweaking the existing insurance rules or regulations.
Not primarily, no. It's more radical than that. It's about shifting focus from trying to patch up a system that they argue is fundamentally flawed, and instead investing energy in building entirely new systems. Systems based on care, on community, on solidarity, where mobility is just accepted as a basic human right, not a commodity.
Wow. Okay, so wrapping this up. The big takeaway here isn't just that the wheelchair industry has problems. It's that these problems are, according to this source, symptoms of a much larger issue.
Yes. A system that consistently puts profit before people, especially when those people are seen as vulnerable or costly.
And that quote you mentioned really hammers it home. The sickness is the system. The cruelty is not accidental, it's economic.
It forces you to look beyond individual companies or policies and examine the underlying economic structures, doesn't it?
It really does. And it leaves you, the listener, with a pretty profound thought from the author.
Which is?
That, this current system wasn't inevitable. There was time before it. And so, logically, there can be a time after it.
A future possibility.
Yeah. But the question is, are we going to actively try and build that different future? Or just passively accept the way things are now?
It's a challenge, really. And the path forward, in the author's view, lies in that resistance, that refusal to accept the status quo and building solidarity.
Insisting on the basic right to move, to participate, to live fully. A right that shouldn't depend on profit margins.
Exactly. That's the core message.